Greetings, folks. Welcome to another one of our Free Friday community classes right here on the YouTubes. I post these classes every single Friday, and sometimes you get these hour-long, immersive, deep digs into a particular topic. You can scroll back through the timeline and find a bunch of those. And sometimes you get something different, like today, where we are going to have this more sort of personal, informal little fireside chat about ancestral herbalism. And rather than talk about what it is or how to engage with that, because I have covered that in other classes, I just want to talk about how this is important to me and how this informs and inspires my own work with the plants. Not only in a spiritual context, because I would say first and foremost, I consider myself somebody who walks a plant spirit path. I practice wort cunning. I think that my primary spirituality is plant-based. Sounds kind of weird, but it tracks. But also here in the clinic, right? Also that the ancestral streams that inform the way that I think about plants and the plants that I work with and the way that I work with plants is rooted in the ways of ancestral herbalism. So I think one of the reasons why this over the years has become more and more important to me as a practitioner, as a clinician too, is that these things that we have inherited from our ancestors, and I'm speaking about a specific group of people from a specific place and kind of in a specific time, but I think you can take my words and apply them to your own ancestral traditions. And also, we collectively can apply this to our collective ancestral herbalisms, right? That we have gathered in to help us survive the world, especially as it is now. Everything that I have, everything that's come down from these various ancestral practices that I follow, the folklore, the stories, the legends, the recipes, the formula, the approach to medicine, even anatomy, pathology, and physiology as it was understood by the ancients. This kind of stuff, as much as it's like, oh, how fun is it that we're going to read this, 10th century herbal or something even older. This stuff is rooted in real people, real people that existed, that lived, that struggled in the same way that you and I struggle, that had successes and victories in the same way that you and I do. And these real people lived in real places. They lived in different climates and bioregions and different geographies where different plants showed up for them in different ways, right? Hopefully in ways that met them where they were and responded to what they needed at any given moment, which is something we talk about a lot in spiritual herbalism, right? That oftentimes the plants that we need the most are the ones that grow most voraciously around us, or the ones we can't get rid of, or the ones that encroach into our human pathways more and more, right? That's not always the case, but certainly happens. So, whenever I look to an old remedy or get inspired about my connection to a particular plant based on something that was written in one of the old herbals or written in an old monograph or preserved in an old charm or ritual working, I am connecting to the wisdom of real people who existed and who probably worked really hard to gain the wisdom that they gained about that plant to be able to respect it enough to either write it down or continually tell it to other people, allowing it to make it all the way to me, right? These are real people, and their investment in this work still exists. That energy, that potential, and those blessings are still there, right? So whenever I call that into my practice, in whatever way that I do, they're there too. And I think that part of why we talk about working with the Herbwise ancestors, working ancestral herbalism so much around here on this channel is folks feel it, right? It's one thing to connect to plants and to feel the presence and the personhood and the wisdom of plant spirits. That in and of itself is so awesome and is enough to, really transform people. But then there's this next layer where it's like everything we know about that plant, everything that allowed us to approach that plant for the relationship we're now having with them, came from people who are also equally invested in our success. And that we can also begin to feel their presence and their response and their reciprocity. So to me, that is just so magical. And it's its own kind of medicine, in the age of people being very preoccupied with the fear of death, doing everything we possibly can not to die, not to age. Our ancestors are trying to tell us that there is more to the story than we might be being told, right? Which I think is very cool. Another thing that I get from looking at ancestral herbalism that I don't get from contemporary herbalism, Renaissance, the Renaissance of herbal medicine, pop herbalism, TikTok herbalism, whatever you want to call it, is the centering of relationship and reciprocity. My ancestors, even just a few hundred years ago, and pretty much everyone else's that I've had the pleasure and privilege of getting to study or research or learn about, we're not talking about herbs as things or resources or commodities that were here to serve humans, right? They were talking about them and writing about them, even in recipes and formulas, in this way that acknowledged their personhood, that acknowledged their power, that acknowledged the role that plants play in the greater cosmos, that they are harmony makers and harmony protectors. So when I practice ancestral herbalism, I don't get the convenience of looking at plants as something here to make my life easier or something here for me to throw into my next spell. I don't get the privilege of thinking about them in terms of what they're good for, right? My ancestors force me to think about plants as they are, to allow plants to exist as they are, as persons, as sovereign, conscious, wise beings with whom I can have the same kinds of deep spiritual relationships my ancestors had, right? So without that connection to ancestral herbalism, I think I would have missed all of this. I think that, maybe I would be lucky and somehow, I would realize the experiences that I was having were not special or unique. But thankfully, I don't have to feel that way because I see over and over and over again in what my ancestors left and what our collective Herbwise ancestors left, that they were doing the same thing, right? They were talking to plants and hugging trees just like we are, right? Which is great. There is so much extant lore, materia medica, herbals that we can lean on because of the blessings of our ancestors. Again, they had to work hard to get what they had and respected enough to hand it on to us. And then you and I now are doing the same thing. We're sitting with these plants, we're learning from them, we're adding to the body of lore that we can then pass on to our children, to our community members, to our apprentices, to whoever, right? We're always adding to the body of lore. This is part of spiritual herbalism, is leaving it better than you found it, leaving it bigger than you found it. But there were real people who put the work in, and because of that, we can flip open these books. In my particular ancestral traditions and in my spiritual practice, I'm fortunate enough to have texts and codexes like the Lacnunga and the various Old English herbariums and even more modern works by people like Maud Grieve and Nicholas Culpeper that point to the way that my Herbwise ancestors related to plants and preserves story and preserves practice and medicine crafting and the experiences of these people about plants. And so I never have to start from zero. I never have to invent a new kind of wheel. I never have to, start the thing going with no energy. There's already something happening. I just have to step into it, right? I have to like jump into the rhythm of things because they've already started it and they continue to nourish it from their own mysteries, which is something when we start opening our heart up to the presence and the wisdom of our Herbwise ancestors, we realize how fiercely they bless our work, how much they are still, from their own perspective, from their own mysteries, how much they are still rooting for us to maintain this medicine and to keep it alive, that it's as important to them as it is to us, even though they're not here anymore, which I think is very cool. You know, there's no new drama. Nothing you can come up with is anything that no one's seen before, right? There are different trappings. We're doing it with cell phones and cars and the internet now, but there are no new problems. There's no new drama. Some iteration of every etiology, every pathology, every spiritual crisis has existed before. And whether it was our ancestors who perceived it and stepped in as cunning folks to remedy it, or the plants themselves witnessing it in the humans, it's been done before. So again, when we link up with these streams of ancestral herbalism, we don't have to start everything from scratch. We can go back and say, well, what charms exist? What recipes and formulas exist? What rituals exist? What folklore exists around this particular, very 21st century drama I'm having, that's related, right? It's all connected. So this is very cool. For folks who have a very direct connection to their ancestors, maybe you're practicing the same type of spirituality as your ancestors. Maybe like me, you're working with the same gods and cosmology and cosmogony and virtues that your ancestors worked with. Um, we can also find plants that will grow where we grow now. Maybe you're in the same place where your ancestors were. That's cool. I'm not. We can find plants that will grow safely where we are now, that are the same plants our near and far Herbwise ancestors worked with. So we can connect with plants who already know us. We can connect with plants who our recent Herbwise ancestors also worked with. And so there's this like triune link there, right? Which really empowers it. This is why when I go through the old herbals and I find a plant that I also work with locally, there's some bioregional species or a variant, or the plant themselves grows where I live, I geek, because I'm like, oh, I can go have a relationship with a plant that, my Herbwise ancestors 150 years ago were also having a very deep relationship with. And it's just another layer of connection. It's another layer of power. Me to the plant, me to my ancestors, the ancestor to me, the ancestor to the plant. Like it goes all the ways, right? Which is very lovely and very cool. And, if you follow a spiritual path that is linked to your ancestors and you're practicing some kind of an ancestral herbalism, either in full or in part, because that's the thing too, like you could dip your toe in it and say, I do lots of other things, but I also do this, right? They dovetail so beautifully together, right? When it's kind of in our heart and in our head that way. And we say, oh, I'm following these virtues and these life ways of my ancestors the best way that I can. And I'm also working with plants and herbal medicine and herbal magic and plant ritual in a way that's similar to how they did it. Suddenly, our spiritual path, or maybe for you, your religion, right? And our work with the plants don't need to be held in separate hands anymore. Like they just link together, right? It all becomes one story. And this was a huge revelation for me, because when I was trying desperately to reconnect to a particular time and place, and I didn't have the lore, and especially the plant lore as dialed in as I have access to it now, it was very difficult. And this is coming from somebody who perseverates on plant spirit work, right? That's just part of my the way my brain works. This is what I do. It's always what I'm thinking about. Even the most non-plant related things that I do in life, I will find a way to let the plants in, right? So when I was able to say, oh, here are my ancestors talking about this spiritual practice, this sacred day, this deity, this god or goddess, this particular hero, this legend, this plant. That having things click in like that is very beautiful, you know. And I've met so many other people over the years of doing this work who have had that same experience and say, "Oh, I started, researching where my grandparents were from or my great grandparents were from, and learning about their perspective of the world and what plants they worked with and how they looked at herbal medicine and what they thought disease was." And all of that comes flooding in to this moment where we live. Like, we are not ancient Anglo-Saxons, we're not ancient Celts, we're not, living in Vedic India. We are where we are in the world that we are, so we need to catch that wisdom and make it relevant for the moment that we exist in, and make it relevant so that it is primed to be poured into the next vessel, that it can move forward, which is exactly what collectively all of our Herbwise ancestors did. And this is why anybody who has access to any variant of an ancestral herbalism, that's why you have that access, right? Because the people in the moment had the foresight to say, we need to make sure this doesn't die with us. We need to make sure that whatever the extenuating circumstances are that might distort this, stamp it out, destroy it, whatever, we need to make sure that it survives. And lo and behold, they did. I don't know how. I look back at the history of so many places where vibrant, rich, beautiful herbal traditions exist, and it is pretty much impossible to wrap my head around how that wisdom survived what it survived, but it did. And so I think we owe it to the people who came before us to radically honor everything that they sent us from the past, to be so grateful for it. And even if you don't jive with it, even if it's not the way you think now, that's cool. You can still make room in your heart for the spirit of it. You don't have to be fully invested in their ways and their culture. I am part of a different culture than my ancestors at this point, but I can still find ways to let all of their green wisdom flood into what I'm doing now, where I'm doing it, when I'm doing it, and how I'm doing it, and even with whom I'm doing it, right? Because there's probably some radical difference there as well. So it's very cool. So, if you have some ability to explore and research even your near ancestry, so I consider that like 150 years or more, right? You don't have to be able to go back 10,000 years. Most of us can't. And that's, prehistory for most people. Stuff wasn't being written down. But if you go back even 150 years to what your family was doing, maybe they were doing it right where you sit right now as you're watching this. Maybe they were thousands and thousands of miles away. Maybe they were on the other side of the world. It's an interesting gate to open, to say, what were they doing? How were they thinking? And you will feel something stir inside of you. And that is them. That is them saying, oh, you got the message. You got that thing we sent you, right? They're just waiting for us to catch it and to embody it and to make it our own and to bring it into the moment. So that's where I'm going to end. Thanks for sticking around. And I would love if you would share something about your own connection to ancestral herbalism, either on a very personal ancestral level or maybe in a more collective global ancestral level, because I think both of them are powerful and have meaning and depth and purpose in our work. See you next time.